Good morrow, one and all. I'm Mr. King, and in today's video, I'm going to be exploring question 3 of the English language paper for OCR. I'll begin by thinking about what the examiners want from you. I'll then give you my advice for how to do really well, and we'll end by looking at a model answer. Before we begin, it's worth saying that question 3 is very similar in both the fiction and in the non-fiction paper. And I'm going to look at a fiction paper example today, but the skills are very transferable to the non-fiction question as well. With that in mind, let's dive straight in. So what is it the examiners want from you in question 3? Or perhaps a better question actually is, what is question 3 going to look like? So let me read you an example question 3 very quickly. So, look again at lines 1 to 23. Explore how the writer presents Miss Brodie's attitude towards Miss Mackay, the headmistress. Support your ideas by referring to the language and structure of this section using relevant subject terminology. Okay, so what do the examiners want from you to answer a question like that? Well, they want you to analyse how language and structure is used by an author to create effects on the reader. The examiners of this question want you to recognise that when a writer writes anything, they want to influence their readers. They want to make them feel joy or despair or feel terrified or feel tension. And our job in this question is to explain or to analyse how their language and how their structural choices make readers feel a certain way. Now I know that the word analyse can be a bit tricky, so I'm going to change the word analyse to this. Examine in detail. Examine in detail how language and structure is used to create effects on the reader, and you have to use relevant subject terminology as we go. If it helps, a slightly different way you could think about the question is thinking about how does the writer say it. It's worth saying that this question is very similar to the type of skill you're assessed on in the English literature GCSE. So in your English literature GCSE, when you have those questions, how is the character presented, how is the theme presented, you have to write in a very similar type of way. Now, before I go any further, you might want to look at the same exam paper with me as I work through it. Now, OCR have very helpfully put some resources online, and I'm going to be using one of their sample assessment materials and looking at the Exploring Effect and Impact paper. I would encourage you to go online to this website. I'm going to put a link in the description below, and I would encourage you to open this paper, read the extract, read question 3, and then come back and we'll look at this question together. Okay, so a minute ago I was explaining the need to analyse, to do language and structural analysis to do well in this question. And in the mark scheme, there is a distinction between students who explain how language and structure is used and those who analyse how language and structure is used. And students who explain will get sort of middling marks, whereas students who analyse will get the higher marks. So we want to be really clear on the difference between explaining and analysing. Now on the screen is a short excerpt from a model answer, and I want you to think about, is this explaining or analysing? By explaining, I mean just making general comments and sort of talking about the content of a quote, whereas analysing is when we examine in detail. It's when we zoom in on individual words or phrases or language choices or structural choices, and we explain how effects are created because of those techniques. So analysing is the more detailed skill. Let's look at this example together. Miss Brodie passed behind her with her head up and shut the door with the utmost meaning. This shows that Miss Brodie judges Miss Mackay because her head is up, so she is looking down at the headmistress. Also, because she closes the door after the headmistress leaves it open, this suggests that Miss Brodie does not approve of Miss Mackay's behaviour. Okay, does that look like an explain or an analyse? Have a little think. This is an explanation. There's a few ways we can know. Firstly, there's quite a long quote copied out. Ideally, you don't want to copy out really long quotes because it takes up time and we haven't got very much time in the exam. Secondly, there's no zooming in on individual words or techniques here, just kind of general comments about the quote in general. So this is an explanation. Now this isn't awful, but it's also not great. It's not going to get you high marks. So let's look at a different answer, which is going to look at the same type of extract, the same quote, and they're going to analyse it rather than explain. Firstly, Miss Brodie's body language implies she judges the headmistress. The imagery of her head up symbolises that she is looking down at the headmistress, which suggests she disapproves of Miss Mackay's behaviour. This is reinforced by the repetition of up, which focuses readers' attention on this judgmental body language and emphasises Miss Brodie's disapproval. Unlike the previous answer, which had a long quote copied out, this one zooms in on the pertinent parts of the quote. It uses short quotes, sometimes only 1 or 2 words long, which is absolutely fine. Secondly, it uses lots of subject terminology to analyse the language. So this student looks at imagery, looks at the symbolism of the head up, looks at the repetition of the word up, and just the general body language and what this suggests about Miss Brodie's attitude towards the headmistress. This is a much better answer because it's analysing how language and structure is used, and it's not just making a general passing comment on a quote. So we should aim for answers like this and not the previous one. It's worth saying, by the way, that this is only a couple of sentences from a question 3. This is not an entire paragraph or an entire answer, so please don't think this is the length or depth that you should be going into. This is just to illustrate the example of a difference between explaining and analysing. Now, having taught this paper for a little while, I know that some students struggle with the difference between language and structure, or more particularly, they're not really sure what is meant by structure. To do well in this exam, you have to write about language and structure. So it's really important we're clear on the difference. It might be worth just very quickly pausing the video and thinking, what does language mean? What language techniques can you think of? And what structural techniques can you think of? For language, here are some of the most common things you could talk about when analysing language. So ideally you want to be zooming in on key words. You might talk about the significance of nouns, verbs or adjectives and what those words suggest. You might talk about the connotations of key words, or you could zoom in on similes, metaphors, personification. You could talk about the symbolism of certain things or the imagery that the author uses. You could even talk about the tone or the mood of the extract. Tone on its own is language, and so is a great thing to write about. What about structure? One of the most useful structural techniques I think to write about is contrast. How do things change or contrast throughout an extract? There's repetition, which we saw in the previous example. Whereas tone on its own is language, a change in tone throughout the extract is structure. So that's a good thing to talk about. If something in the beginning foreshadows something that happens at the end, you could talk about foreshadowing, or if there's a climax at the end or an anticlimax at the end of the extract, you could talk about that. Talk about listing, or how does the text begin and how does it end. These are all relevant structural things to talk about. One structural thing that you should avoid talking about is sentence length. This is something that the examiners explicitly tell teachers that they don't want to see students writing about. Examiners hate it when students write about long sentences versus short sentences, because it's difficult to write very much which is useful about that. So I would generally avoid writing about sentence length. You could talk about sentence type, for example, compound sentences, complex sentences, but even then I would be wary of doing so because it's not often I see that done well. So I would generally avoid writing about sentence length or sentence type. Okay, having gone through the difference between explaining and analysing, and having talked about the difference between language and structure, let me give you my advice for this question in 60 seconds or as close as I can manage it. So firstly, take your time to read the extract. You should read both extracts in full before the exam begins, and you should read it again before you answer question 3. One thing you should not do is read the first part of the extract and then write about it, then read the next bit of the extract and then write about that. Students who do that tend to misunderstand the extract, and at the end of the day, this question appears in the reading section of the exam. So if you're not going to read the extract carefully, it's going to be difficult to be successful. Secondly, read the question carefully. I have seen so many students either misinterpret the question because they didn't look at it carefully, or only write about half of the question because they didn't realise that the question wanted you to focus on 2 different things, for example. Or I've seen students misread the question so badly that they misread the line references, because often this question will tell you to only look at a certain part of the extract. For example, in the one we're looking at, lines 1 to 23. So I encourage all of my students to draw a box around the extract you have to write about, just to be sure you're writing about the correct thing. If you get the extract wrong, you can't get any marks, so it's worth doing that. As we've discussed, make sure you're analysing the extract, zooming in on keywords or structural features. Don't just explain or make general comments about the content of quotes. As we've seen, use shorter quotes. Sometimes 1 or 2 word long quotes can be absolutely fine. And try to write about the whole extract. I don't mean write about every single sentence, but if you're given 23 lines to write about, as we are in this question, don't just write about the first half. Make a few comments about quotes in the first half, and also try to make a few comments about quotes towards the end. Students who can show an awareness and a knowledge of the whole extract that you're asked to focus on tend to do better. What about common problems and things to avoid doing? Firstly, you don't need a waffly introduction. You don't need to say, in this answer, I'm going to be looking at how language and structure is used to explore blah, blah, blah. You don't need to do that. Get straight to the point. One way that Miss Brody's attitude towards the head teacher is shown is through, get straight to the point. You don't need a conclusion either, it's worth saying. Secondly, don't be a feature spotter. Don't just identify subject terminology. Don't do the equivalent of going, look, there's a metaphor, look, there's a personification. You don't get marks for identifying metaphors. You don't get marks for identifying imagery, but you do get marks for explaining why that imagery has been used, explaining the effect of the metaphor. So make sure you explain the effect of the subject terminology that you identify. Try to avoid really vague comments. One thing that I see students do sometimes is saying, this has a positive effect, this has a negative effect. And that's actually quite a basic comment. I would try to go beyond that. If you're saying that it creates a positive mood, what type of positive mood? Can you be more specific? Or instead of saying it was negative, can you be more specific there also? You should definitely avoid phrases like, this has an effect on the reader, because that doesn't tell us anything. Tell me what effect, tell me the specific effect it has on the reader. Please don't tell the examiner that it makes the reader want to read on. I've yet to read a piece of writing where the author doesn't want the reader to read on. And definitely don't write, it puts an image in the reader's mind. You can tell the examiner a specific image it puts in the reader's mind, be precise, but don't say it puts a general image in the reader's mind, because again, that tells us nothing. And one of the other common problems is students are often quite good at writing about language, but not so good at writing about structure. You do need to write about language and structure. If you don't write about structure, it will hold you back in the marks. So make sure that you do that. Okay, what I'm going to do now is look at an extract from a model answer. So this is not an entire answer. This is about a third maybe of of an answer. I often get asked how long should an answer be, and that's really difficult to answer because it does depend on your handwriting size. But generally, if you've got kind of an average size handwriting, I would expect about a page of A4, maybe a bit longer, roughly, give or take, depending on your handwriting size. So here is a model paragraph, which is a smaller part of a longer answer. Let's look at it together. And this is answering the question 3 from the paper that I asked you to look up earlier. So here we go. It begins in the same way we saw earlier and then adds to it. Firstly, Miss Brodie's body language implies that she judges the headmistress. The imagery of her head up symbolises that she is looking down at the headmistress, which suggests that she disapproves of Miss Mackay's behaviour. This is reinforced by the repetition of up, which focuses readers' attention on the judgmental body language and emphasises Miss Brodie's disapproval. Also, the contrast between Miss Brodie and Miss Mackay reinforces Miss Brodie's judgmental attitude because of her differences. The headmistress entered in a hurry, leaving the door wide open. The word hurry suggests that Miss Mackay is a bit disorganised and chaotic. In contrast to the headmistress's hurry, the verb shut implies Miss Brodie acted carefully and deliberately, which might suggest she disapproves of Miss Mackay's haste. Furthermore, Miss Brodie shut the door of utmost meaning. Here, the imagery of shutting the door when the headmistress had left it open implies Miss Brodie subtly disapproves of Miss Mackay's behaviour. This disapproval is reinforced by the phrase utmost meaning, which suggests the closing of the door was a subtle way for Miss Brodie to challenge Miss Mackay's hurried behaviour. Okay, so this is an answer which analyses the language and structure used in the first couple of lines of the extract. So firstly, let's check we've got language and structure. So we've got talk about imagery, which is language, and symbolism, which is also language. We've got the repetition of up, so repetition is a structural feature. What else do we have? We've got the contrast between Miss Brodie and Miss Mackay, so that's a structural feature, looking at the difference between two characters and what that implies. We've got a look at the word hurry, which is language, the verb shut, which is also language. What else? The imagery of shutting the door is also language, and the phrase utmost meaning. So ultimately, we've got a lot of language, a bit of structure. It's not entirely 50-50, but there's a clear attempt to write about language and structure, which is a good first start. What else do we have? Secondly, this student does not just identify techniques. For example, the student doesn't say, look, there's some repetition. We're told the repetition of up focuses readers' attention on the judgmental body language and emphasises Miss Brodie's disapproval, which is really, really good. We also have lots of short quotes being analysed, all being used to make clear that, in this student's opinion, Miss Brodie judges the headmistress, which I think is a perfectly reasonable thing to argue based on the extract. I think this is a really good answer. It's got a lot of analysis. It doesn't have lots of long quotes copied out and then just generic comments about them, but precise techniques were identified. The verb shut implies Miss Brodie acted carefully and deliberately, and that might suggest she disapproves of Miss Mackay's haste. Looking at the contrast between Miss Brodie and Miss Mackay and what that might suggest too is also really, really useful. So I hope you found this video useful as a way to look at question 3 of the English language paper. If you wanted to, perhaps you could continue this answer. You could write the rest of it to practice these skills. I hope you found this useful, and if you want to ask any questions, please do so in the comments below. Please do like and subscribe if you'd like more videos like this, and until next time, cheerio.